President Obama had 3 national security advisors over 8 years in office. President Trump has had 3 national security advisors over less than 3 years in office. President Trump's first national security advisor, Michael Flynn, served only 21 days in the job, the shortest tenure of any national security advisor in history. Michael Flynn was in court today for a pre-sentencing hearing for the crimes he has pleaded guilty to, crimes he committed in the White House while serving as national security advisor when he lied to the FBI. Michael Flynn was replaced by H.R. McMaster. H.R. McMaster was then replaced by John Bolton, and John Bolton will be replaced next week, according to the president. The position of national security advisor does not require Senate confirmation, so the only possible struggle for the president in appointing a new national security advisor is finding someone who will accept the job. It was an honor for Susan Rice to accept the offer from President Obama to serve as his 3rd national security advisor. She served in that position for the entire second term of the Obama presidency. In the first term of the Obama presidency, Susan Rice served as the ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Susan Rice will join us next. Joining our discussion now is someone who can give us an invaluable perspective on the job of National Security Advisor. Susan Rice is the last person to serve in the job of National Security Advisor before Donald Trump started appointing National Security Advisors. Susan Rice served as President Obama's National Security Advisor from 2013 to January of 2017. And before that, she served as President Obama's ambassador to the United Nations from 2009 to 2013. Her new book, Tough Love, My Story of Things Worth Fighting For, comes out next month. Ambassador Rice, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I just wanted to get what was your first reaction today when you heard the news that John Bolton was either fired, according to Donald Trump, or resigned, according to John Bolton.
Well, Lawrence, it's good to be with you. I confess when I heard the news, I was working out, and I was a bit surprised to see it flash across the screen. I had to plug in the headphones to find out what was actually going on. I was surprised more by the timing of the announcement. It was unexpected in that regard, but not the actual outcome, because for quite a while, it's been apparent that John Bolton and Donald Trump were on very different sheets of music when it comes to almost every national security issue of import. And either Bolton was going to continue to be publicly humiliated and fail to persuade the president of his course of action, or the president was going to capitulate, which seemed highly unlikely. So something was going to come a cropper at some stage, it seemed.
But it's hard to think of anyone who, in Republican politics and foreign policy, or any of our politics and foreign policy, who agrees with Donald Trump on North Korea, his approach to North Korea, on this idea of let's invite the Taliban to Camp David, or on the Trump tariffs, which are a national security issue. It's hard to think of who would fit.
Well, I think there are degrees of fitting. I mean, let's break this down. There's 2 levels of challenge. One is finding a national security advisor who can serve the president effectively from the vantage point of being a good national security advisor. I think Bolton failed in that regard to the extent that he refused to run a proper national security decision-making process that involved all of the cabinet-level principals sitting around the table, wrestling with the analysis and the facts and the intelligence and the very difficult options that surround any tough national security decision. He didn't run that process, and he arrogated a lot of authority to himself, and I think was wrong on a number of important issues. Having said that, we could have the second coming of, as national security advisor, the greatest one in history, running a perfect process, and still we'd have a president who could care less and wasn't interested in facts, history, analysis, or the national interest. And that's what we have. So we have 2 problems: a national security decision-making process that is badly broken, and a president who is not interested in rational decision-making that serves the national interest.
What should people be
So yes, it would be a hard job for anybody.
Yeah. What should people be hoping for in the next national security advisor? And I include opponents of the president. What should they be hoping for in the next national security advisor?
Somebody with integrity, somebody with judgment, somebody who recognizes that being national security advisor is not a solo endeavor. I liken it to being a point guard leading a basketball team, and I write about that in my book. It is a team sport, and we don't seem to have had that of late. I also would like to see a national security advisor who's prepared to tell the president the truth and differ with the president when necessary. In that regard, I give Bolton credit because the national security advisor is supposed to keep his or her counsel private, but is supposed to give their honest and best judgment. And in this instance, we have a president who seems to not want to hear anything other than yes.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to be an illustration of many things, but one of them might be this is what happens to you if you do tell President Trump what you honestly think about something. In this case, John Bolton is reported to have been maybe the key player in stopping the Taliban visit to Camp David, and that frustrated the president, and now John Bolton's gone. That may be the lesson of this. This is what happens if you do tell the president the truth.
Well, then we're going to have probably 7 or 8 national security advisors, if we have decent ones, by the time this administration gets through 4 years, because the last thing we need, whether, as the head of NOAA or national security advisor, is leadership that lies or leadership that obfuscates or leadership that isn't interested in the national interest. And that's even more dangerous than anything that I can think of.
President Obama had, as I recall, a grand total of 3 national security advisors over the 8 years, with you serving the longest in that office. President Trump has now gone through 3. He'll be starting his 4th, he promises, next week. And so they could be on track to getting close to 8, even in the first term. What does that do to the national security processes within the administration?
It's extraordinarily disruptive, and it's irresponsible, quite frankly. To illustrate the point, when I was named National Security Advisor in early June of 2013, I had more than about a month of overlap with my predecessor, Tom Donilon. That was time in which, even though I was still serving as United Nations ambassador, I spent most of my time in Washington meeting with Tom, going in great depth through the issues that were on our plate and the processes that I needed to understand. I spent time in national security meetings, the president's daily briefing with the president of the United States. I got a sense of how President Obama wanted that role to be played, a very, very important role at the right hand of the president. And when I came back to Washington to take on the job July 1st, and not only was I well prepared by Tom in that process, but obviously I had the experience of having sat at the principal's decision-making table for the prior 4.5 years. It is not at all clear who President Trump is going to get to sit in the National Security Advisor's office, who will have the experience, the judgment, as well as the preparation to hit the ground running. And with all that's going on in the world, that is exactly what we need.
Let me ask you about this story that has broken in our news over the last 24 hours. Major news organizations, including NBC News, reporting on the extraction of a spy working for the United States within the Russian government. This occurred during your watch as National Security Advisor. According to the stories, that's when the harvest of the information was coming in from this spy, and there was a first consideration of extracting him during your time in office. What can you share with us about that, and what elements of the reporting could you confirm for us?
Lawrence, I can't discuss classified information, and I've never done it in my career, and I'm not going to start now.
Is there anything that you would caution the public about in what they're reading about this story now?
No, I don't want to get into parsing the story and what may be accurate or inaccurate. It's just not appropriate.
Ambassador Susan Rice, well, I think we understand that completely. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.